when I'm in the studio with a musician that's stressed out like that because they're paying by the hour and they're like, yeah, this is going through my funds pretty quick.
Yeah.
I kind of feel that pressure on me, but that's not necessarily from a mixing standpoint. That's mainly from a tracking standpoint.
That is like interpersonal skills. Like you got to read the client in those circumstances.
You're listening to the GWNL-Podcast. Guys with no lives talking about audio.
Hello and welcome to episode 7. I have a new microphone and we're talking about studio versus live sound. We have Ben, we have Bryant, and we sadly still have me. They haven't fired me yet, guys. So we have this week, episode 7, GWNL-Podcast, because I can't say the actual name that those things are an acronym of. We're talking about studio versus live sound. I already just said that. Doesn't matter. With that being said, I am the live sound engineer, and it's actually going to be a game show of who wins, because there's 2 studio engineers, Ben and Bryant, and then there's me, who's the live sound guy. So why don't we get ourselves started off here with Ben instead of Bryant, because I always go to Bryant first. Ben, why don't you talk to me about what you see as the differences between studio and live sound, because I know you've done both. What are your thoughts? Ready, set, go.
Okay, so to me, the biggest thing is the immediacy of live sound versus the magnifying glass of studio. So when you're doing live sound, there's immediacy. You have to think on your feet and do your mix, make those changes quick. And the blessing of that, the benefit is that when a mistake happens, it's like there and then gone. And then as long as it sounds good after you fix the mistake, then you're good. And that mistake is like gone and forgotten. With the studio, if there's a mistake, it lies under the magnifying glass forever. And so you have to go in and fix it, and it's very tedious. And that's the big difference. I mean, pretty much, other than that, there's a lot of similarities. But that is the biggest difference to me, those 2 things.
What about you, Bryant? What are your thoughts?
As far as similarities and differences?
Yeah, man. I've worked gigs with you.
Yeah. For me personally, I get a lot more stressed when I'm running live sound. Usually it's because of time constraints, but I'd say, in live sound, if something goes wrong, it is a passing moment. But oftentimes, if it's like really bad feedback, it's like, oh man, this sound guy doesn't know what he's doing. Yeah,
that's one. I don't care who you are. If you get feedback, you're pathetic. I don't care.
Well, even sometimes it's like, oh, yep, that fed back, and that was definitely my fault because I didn't take the time to ring out the monitors or something like that.
Or they didn't give you the time.
Or I just moved something up a little too far there. And, yeah.
As far as studio goes, it's extremely tedious. Just it's printed. Everything that's there, you're going to be listening to the same thing over and over again. And so if there's some sort of like timing mistake, or there's like a blip or a pop or a click or somewhere, you're going to be able to notice those things. There's something that I'm mixing for a client right now that they sent me like 1 million tracks in one of the songs, and at the beginning, I'm hearing this like clicking, and I'm like, what is this coming from? So I had to like go through and solo each individual track to find the one of 70 guitar tracks that has the click, and then figure out how I can get rid of that click. And I can't.
And it's just use 69 guitar tracks. That's the solution.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm not using that one guitar track because
that's fair.
It's an exact double of another one. I think they used 2 mics on that one, and there was some interference or something with the ribbon mic that they used. So I'm using the 57 instead of the ribbon for that. So, yeah, those are kind of my thoughts. The tediousness of the studio versus the stress of being in the moment for live sound.
So I guess I'm the only one that is more stressed in the studio than in live sound. No, I literally mix until I hate it. I absolutely despise the track when I send it. I'm like, I'm done with this. I don't even care. Screw this. Because No, because you can sit there and you're like, oh yeah, I just tweak this thing, and then like 6 hours later, your snare sounds horrible. You can't get it to fit in the mix, and like it's either sticking out too much or whatever, and you've tweaked, and your ears aren't even freaking working, and the worst thing is like I work at it like a live sound engineer that has a show in 5 minutes for 8 hours. I'm like, yeah, dude, I'm gonna mix this track.
That's why it's so stressful for you, man.
Yeah, well, I mean, like, I kind of do it to myself because, like, I'll have these deadlines that I'll just put it off, partially because of work, partially because I'm me. And I'm like, I do my best work under pressure. That's partially my fault. I'll admit to that. I think a lot of studio engineers, though, do find themselves into this endless game of tweaking. Oh, I could have just tweaked that thing. I feel like because I started more as a live sound person than a studio guy, in a lot of ways, I'm almost more willing to just say, all right, boom, like, whatever.
That's good enough, right?
Good enough. Yeah, like, it's good enough. And I might get myself into trouble for that.
Good enough. That's good enough.
Yeah. I do, like, when I mix, whether I'm in a live situation or in the studio, I do a thing that somebody popular called gut mixing, and basically I just do whatever I feel. I do my first instinct, and that'll be my first pass in like a studio setting or in live sound. I'll do that, and then just kind of like go with my instincts, and then I'm like, okay, this is like my starting point. Right. And then during the show for live sound, I may do some more tweaks, but obviously for my mix, that first pass is just, all my instincts. I'll spend like 15 minutes just kind of doing my instinctual first impressions. And then from there, I try to limit myself on the amount of time that I spend to cut down on that. Because if I don't, then I can spend 8 hours working on a snare and it still sounds like garbage. The snare's gonna sound like garbage no matter what.
8-hour garbage snare.
I mean, garbage in, garbage out, right?
Yeah. Well, that's a good point. Oh, I don't know if you were done or not, but I don't care. I'm just gonna keep talking.
Go on.
No,
that's rude.
But yeah, that's interesting because I've noticed as I've gotten more comfortable with stuff, and I've done a lot of stuff on the computer with a mouse,
Yeah.
But I've also done more consoles in live sound, but like studio consoles too, and I've been teaching on this old Soundcraft console.
The Soundcraft K2, I remember that thing.
Exactly.
The sound crap is what we used to tape over the C.
And so it's like a retired console from a hall that's now in a studio to be an analog mixing studio thing. And so, I've been showing the students how to do EQ and stuff like that. And the other day I was, pulling up, like EQing this mix like really quick for him and showing all the stuff. And I realized, and I'd heard something recently from one of these big monster recording engineer, like successful mixing engineers and producers, about how they still mix on the analog mixer because they could do stuff so much faster. And I thought about that. I'm like, I don't know. I can do stuff pretty fast on the computer. But then I realized this last week as I was working on that console, and I'm like, high pass filter. I can do multiple high pass filters. I've got
and you
two
can
hands,
move like two hands at a time.
Yeah, and I'm like, I can dial in the EQ, that gut mixing sort of thing. I can dial that in on an analog console, like really quick.
Yeah.
Because you've got all those knobs to just reach to, and it's even quicker than on a digital console. I mean, on the digital console, if I have like similar EQ that I'm going to do on a bunch of things, I can just copy and paste, which is fast too. But like being able to reach up and grab those knobs makes it super quick.
I'd agree.
Yeah. I think that's why in a studio a hybrid workflow has become so popular, where oftentimes big name engineers they don't even do any of the like tedious stuff. They have assistants to get their session all set up and get it routed correctly, and then they use their control surface to
or their real console,
or they're using a real console. Yeah.
SSLs, man.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the main reasons that the SSL got so big was because of its like automation capabilities.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's another side
That's
conversation. Sorry.
No, I agree. I will say this. I think being in live sound has forced me to refine my process. I think I've talked about that before. I'm not going to get too crazy into that, but where you don't have time to sit there and consider like every option and like, you know what I mean? Like I get the whole gut mixing thing. I think that's great. But like I have to do things in clear stages in a live situation so that I don't miss something. If I don't gain stage everything in like as like a bulk package, I could have missed something if I'm not paying attention to that. And then essentially I don't have that sound, you know, and everyone's already like going, and like if the show's already going, I could try to adjust the gain, but now I'm adjusting people's in-ears. Now I'm adjusting, you know, I don't have split snakes with what I'm doing right now. I'm hoping to get one, but yeah, like there's a lot of things like that where I have to refine my process and be quicker because I have clients that are expecting results. And it's not their job to know everything about what I'm doing. It is their job to respect what I'm doing because I am giving them a service for sure. But like, it's important though that like, you know your process when you're mixing live. A lot of people, there's some people who can do it by gut and you know take their time and like mosey through the mix. But I'm gonna be honest, like. Knowing your process helps you so much. Whereas in live, or rather in the studio, I can just be like, oh yeah, I'm going to just work on my kick and like fine tune my kick. And then I'm going to compare that to my bass. And I'm going to, you know, put both of those, I'm going to solo those things together, blah, blah, blah. I will say this, one other thing, and I ran into this issue today. Because of that, there are ways of kind of doing a hybrid approach. Like today at work, I recorded this big band that I'm working with, and I recorded the whole ensemble. Because I knew with them rehearsing, there was zero way I was going to have the time to actually go through and set my EQs for all those individual instruments. And so I could just take the recording and I could just record them and then play it back and then do all of my adjustment on the board. So I can save my scene and save my show so that when they come in, oh, wow, this sounds way better. It's like, yeah, well, you know, let me do my thing and I can make it work. And that's nice if you have a consistent gig, but that's not always the case.
Your virtual sound check, right? That's what Yeah. Which is a really cool thing.
It's rad.
A nice benefit of digital consoles. Yeah. So that is recording, you know, the multi-tracks basically, and then you just kind of switch over the inputs and it plays back the multi-tracks as if you're still recording the live band. So,
yeah, and if you do it right, you can just get with no effects in it. Sometimes you have to, like for digital boards, you have to watch out because sometimes you can have all of the processing that you're already doing on it. You don't want that. Well, you want to make sure to set it the other way.
Yeah. Don't most of them like default to being like virtual sound check where it's like literally right after the converter?
No. Sometimes they will, but and here's the other thing too. If you share your mixer with other people, sometimes people do stupid things. So you have to watch out for that too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Kind of along those lines, I was just thinking, as far as like workflow goes, I think that's why it's important to kind of know kind of what different things sound like in different frequencies. So like, you know, what gives the bass drum its oomph and what gives it its thwack, or things like that. Like where do consonants sit in a male vocal versus a female vocal? Where's the tone for a vocal? Or what does boxiness sound like? What does honkiness sound like? Things like that. That way, as you're doing your mix, whether it's live or studio, you know, mixing is solving problems in a lot of situations. It's also an art and can be artistic, but I think first and foremost, if it wasn't recorded well, your first like priority is, you know, let's solve some problems. And if it was recorded well, your problem is, well, let's make this, you know, let's mix this, let's make it sound good together.
Well, you know, and that's an interesting thing too. We keep focusing on mixing, and like there's so much more that these two things have in common than just mixing. But even like assessing problems, I mean, when it comes to troubleshooting, there are a load of different problems that are experienced in the studio that are different than the load of problems that come in live sound. Like we don't have to deal with RF all over the place in the studio.
Let me just point this one out to you. Like, I feel like a lot of studio like engineers kind of are like, they get their whole thing set up and like they've set up all their routing and everything, and it's all in this nice little clean patch bay. And then there's me who's like rushing to get a show. I'm like throwing a cable across the freaking stage while, you know, and I have to like figure out, okay, why are inputs 17 through 32 not working for me right now? Oh my gosh, like what am, you know, and like I have to figure that out. It's like very messy. It's dirty.
But that still happens in the studio too. Like there's always problems. The funny thing is
that just means you're incompetent.
Yeah. No. So there's a
got him.
We had a little studio tour recently, and it was like a couple weeks ago, and the guy that was like showing us the studio and was like showing us, you know, some like studio concepts. He had to just kind of throw things together, and it was it's set up to be like a student studio, but it's really nice. They have like an API console. And anyway, he had everything routed just fine, and then all of a sudden, when we came in, you know, Murphy's Law, you know, what can go wrong will go wrong, and something happened. Couldn't get sound to the musicians that were in the live room that were supposed to be like helping with this demonstration, and then couldn't get sound from one of the mics that was on the guitar on the guitar cab, and so he was like, what the heck? This was just working, but you know, he made those adjustments on the fly. Or you know, he's like, oh, let me check the cable. Oh, it's not the cable. Okay, it's this channel. Let me do a different channel, and it worked.
It's true, and that's the thing, and that's the similarity is the troubleshooting is following the signal flow, and it's like even though the signal flow might go through the air at some point in live sound, or might travel through, you know, hundreds of feet of wall or something like that. Or this snake that's getting stepped on by people. In the studio, you're traveling through the wall, or you're doing, you know, and you've still got to follow that signal flow to troubleshoot. But we had that same thing here with this studio. You know, we just got it finished, and we've tested things extensively. So we're, like Joe said, it's always set up, and it's just perfect. And it really is really slick. And there's,
exactly.
We have the patch bay, you know, but then we had this lady come in, and she wanted to transfer from cassette to CD. And I have a cassette player, but it's the one thing that I haven't tested yet in the studio. And so it's like we're scrambling. And then usually I like run it through this mixer to have more gain, but then I turn the mixer on and things are going weird with the power and stuff. And so then I ended up piping it through some line inputs on a preamp, and that worked. But it was like scrambling for a while, and then trying to find the right cables and adapters, you know, RCA to quarter inch adapters, and we had RCA to XLR adapt. Anyways, it's bound to happen no matter how much preparation you do. Even like before this podcast, my interface, which was working earlier today, like all of a sudden wasn't working, and I had to restart right before we started, you know?
Yeah.
So it's just, there's bound to be problems.
I also want to highlight one other thing, and I don't think this is a difference between studio and live, but I think it's something that maybe new engineers might not fully understand. Because like you have these A-list, like A1 engineers or like first engineers out there who all they do is mix. Like that's their gig, and they're like, yeah, like you were saying earlier, Bryant, like they have like these techs come in, they set up the session, they like color coordinate things, and then the first engineer comes in and he's like, yes, get me my coffee, servants, you know, and like even in live sound we have like A1 engineers. So 90% of your life, if you are especially a freelancer, is a lot of interpersonal connections. It's a lot of like planning, logistics, like everything else that surrounds what you're doing. And then like 5% of your time is mixing, like, which is the thing that most of what you are gauged off of. Like that's it. Like when I mix live sound, they're not thinking, oh, well, this guy knows how to manage a stage. He knows how to plug in like all these things and route, you know, and manage all this RF interference and like all these other things. They're not thinking that. They're like, dude, this mix sounds so horrible. They're in a gymnasium. Like they're complaining about the mix, and like everything is literally stacked on my shoulders. And I don't think it's any more easier for studio engineers. I think it's different because of the time constraint for sure. But like most of what you're doing as an engineer, especially if you're freelancing, is everything but mixing.
Yeah.
It's true. That's good. I mean, it's the same thing in studio work too.
Yeah.
There's a whole lot of, you know,
marketing, clientele.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that you
referencing.
spend your time on that isn't the glamorous part.
Yeah.
You know?
And if you're doing like also like from a musician's perspective, being in the studio can be pretty stressful, and so that stress can transfer to the engineer, especially if you're paying by the hour. You can you can kind of get upset at your engineer if they're taking their dandy time. Because you're like, man, I'm paying you $100 an hour to do this. Like, come on.
And dude's just like moseying, like it's 3 hours in, and he's still setting out XLR. Like,
it's like
Gosh,
I don't want to, not to knock on like some bigger studios, but like if I were like a lower budget artist and saved my dimes and pennies to go to like a higher end studio, I don't want to be spending 3-4 hours just to try to get a guitar tone. And
right.
I know that some musicians do feel that stress, and that when I'm in the studio with a musician that's stressed out like that because they're paying by the hour and they're like, yeah, this is going through my funds pretty quick.
Yeah.
I kind of feel that pressure on me, but that's not necessarily from a mixing standpoint. That's mainly from a tracking standpoint.
That is like interpersonal skills. Like, you got to read the client in those circumstances. I know there are studios that, like, there's this one studio around that they don't do hourly rate. They just do like a package price sort of thing, like day rate, and try to keep it to the day rate thing so that people aren't stressed. Mm-hmm. So they know that they're just going to work on this throughout the day. And like, I've also had those circumstances where I can see people starting to get stressed, and I just try to be like, you just have to read the situation.
Yeah.
But, and I'm like, the clock is stopped, because especially if I have technical difficulties for me, I'm like, okay, well, we're stopping the clock while I'm doing this, And so I always try to be like really like,
conscious about that.
Yeah. And like when I'm totaling up the time, I'm always like rounding down, and sometimes people, because you round down, they're just like, they actually end up paying you more than you told them, because they're like, oh, you rounded down too much. And that's a good problem to have, where they're paying you more than you're asking them to pay you because you're trying to be so generous,
Yeah.
But yeah, you do have to read it. And it's true. And in live sound, you're still trying to deal with the client and appease them. And it's like showtime starts in a couple minutes, and you're still like under the console plugging things in because you're searching for a problem,
Yeah, and I'll be honest, like you guys are saying, sometimes stuff happens. Like I hate to say it, but like the old IT adage, turn it off and on again. I cannot tell you how many times that has saved my bacon 5 to 10 minutes before a show. I hate that it works every time too. But just kind of like a story along that. There was a guy that I recently met that used to run. He was a technical director for a really high end church, and during their show, during one of their ceremonies or sermons, I don't know what it's called, the pastor was getting really intimate and was about to deliver a message. Then all of a sudden, all the lights went crazy and was like police lights type thing. It completely ruined the mood, and so technical directors getting the wrath of God from this pastor.
Literally.
And hurries and has to try and suss it out and can't figure out what's going on. So finally he goes to where the circuit breaker is and turns everything off, and then on again. It fixed it, but after the show they found out that one of the DMX cables was too close to one of their Lecos, and
melted it.
The cable fused to the Leco.
Like melted.
So
that's
it was
so
like,
funny.
that's not something you can really fix mid-show, especially in like a high impact moment like that.
Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna take a moment, and I'm about to drop some truth on live sound engineers out there.
Here it comes.
Yeah, I know. I told them before this, and I was like, no. Just because you can plug things in and make sound come out of speakers doesn't make you a good engineer. As far as mixing is concerned, I understand that you only get a little bit of time to work on your mixes and yada yada yada, but honestly, a lot of live sound engineers, I have good friends, people I like that get paid money because they know how to plug things in. not because they're actually good at like managing problems, and they're probably good at troubleshooting for sure. And again, I kind of come back to that whole like, well, you know, like there's a lot more to this job than just mixing good. As much as I say that,
you know, the funny thing is,
Yeah.
if I could I'm just going to interrupt. That's what I just keep
Rude.
doing. I'm like,
Jerk.
I'm just going to interrupt
Yeah.
and apologize, but not really apologize. No, but to add to that, like it's so true in the live sound world. I mean, and I'll probably get like a lot of hate for this too, but
yeah, screw that guy. That band guy doesn't know crap.
there are so many people in the live sound world that just work their way up from like roadie, you know, or hang around guy, to knowing enough so they can plug the right things in. And they literally
I laugh
have,
because I worked with people
Yeah.
like that. Like they
They
were just
lit-
drunk after the show, and they're like, "Here, push this case for me." And so that's how they worked. Oh my gosh, keep going.
And they
Yeah.
literally have like no audio knowledge at all, and they're just skating by the skin of their teeth. And I've taught multiple live sound classes, and I always tell this to the students, because one thing I tell them to do, I'm like, go to a live sound show and like see if you can help out. And I've had a lot of people that have found jobs and success just from going and like wrapping cables and helping out and talking to the sound guy. But I also tell them, I also warn them, I'm like, sometimes when you talk to the sound guy about stuff, they'll get really defensive, and it's because they barely know how to do their job. And if they sense that somebody knows a little bit more than them, they'll get super defensive.
Okay.
And
I also want to counter that, but so there's that, and then here's the old adage, and I think everyone will agree with me on this. There are two things that everyone knows: their own job and sound. Because if you have 2 ears, suddenly you're now an expert on mixing. Because sorry, but how many shows have I worked where some drunk dude's coming? Oh man, I can't hear that guitar, man. Can you like? And it's like, oh yeah, dude, pull out the dummy fader. Boop. Yeah, dude, I'll bring that up for you. Don't worry about it. And then you just go back to doing what you're doing. And it's like, seriously, dude? Like, I get it, okay?
Yeah.
Like, I get defensive because it's like, dude, shut up and leave
It's
me
true.
alone. Let me do my job.
There's legitimate reason to get defensive because you got people like that. But I mean, I've had lots of live sound guys where I just go and like just try to say hi, and they get super defensive.
Yeah.
And
I've
it's just
definitely
like,
seen that.
Yeah, I'm like, man, I was just like checking out the board, you know, asking you a question about it. But then you ask a question and they don't know the answer, you know, or they. But yeah, so I mean, but there are a lot of really competent people out there as well. It's not just incompetent.
Just because they're live sound doesn't mean they're incompetent.
Yeah.
But just because you can plug things in doesn't mean you're good. Like,
Yeah. And I think there's more incompetence you can get by with that kind of incompetence in the live sound world than you can in the studio. In the studio, it shines through really. If you're incompetent like that, it just doesn't work. I mean, there are a lot of people. I've met people that have little setups and they do stuff. They produce good stuff and record good stuff, but they have like no knowledge of anything, and they figured out how to do it. But they actually had some, you know, competence. But yeah, in the live sound world, you can just figure out which buttons to push. And yeah, if I move this, I saw a guy move this way one time and it worked well. So I just keep doing that, you know?
Yeah. I saw this dude put limiters on like every single channel, and it sounded really good. So I'm gonna just do that on like all of my inputs, you know, and then just like.
If I turn the faders all the way up and the master
Yeah, so
down,
like plus 12 sounds
really-
way better than that stupid 0. Like, who does that? No, I like to see. I like to see it when it goes like the light goes red. That's when it really sounds good.
Red means good.
Okay, but like, I can I just say, when I've dealt with so many broadcast situations, I've like looked at their like system and I see that their audio is peaking, and so I'll turn down the gain, but they didn't even hear it. They didn't even know their audio was like peaking, and I'm like, do you
Yeah,
know
it's
what you're doing?
Do you not hear that distortion that's occurring?
I know. The best is when they're like in front of you and you can like see their console, their like screen, and you can see it pegging, and you're like turning it down.
And this isn't
I've
even
had
like
the
like
same
low
thing.
tier stuff. This is like, I'm talking like news, like people, like popular news channels and stuff, or like, you know, or like news. Oh gosh. Oh my gosh.
Most people that I've met that,
Yeah.
sorry to say this, but most people that I've met that start with video and then are primarily like video people, and then they're like, yeah, I know sound. You're like, Yeah, keep telling yourself that, man.
Okay, but it's the same thing with some lighting engineers too. Like, okay, like I'm about to.
Now we're just like
I'm
knocking
about to
on-
piss on
we're just dumping on everyone.
Sorry, I like opened the floodgates
Yeah, you
and now we're
No,
just
like,
knocking
'cause-
on everybody.
There was this one girl at college who was doing sound for their theater department, and she came to a live sound course. This is back before you were there, Ben. And I remember her like in this class, and she was like absorbing all of this audio knowledge, and she like realized how bad their wireless microphones were for the theater side. And so she's like championing fixing their wireless microphones for the musicals so that they can sound good. Like, you have to realize these things were falling apart. Antennas were like wires were showing. Like, this is like not good. And this girl is just trying to get those things to work. And the dude's like, oh, we don't have enough money to pay for that wireless, but we do have enough money to spend another $10,000 on lights. Like, forget paying for like new antennas or I don't even know, like anything worthwhile. And like even like the microphones were like, you see copper. You probably having people getting shocked on these musicals, and like these theater people are like, oh, we don't need new mics. They got like these Samson, like these like $100 or less like wireless microphones. Like this is gonna like work really well, and like
Yeah. You'll find though that's the thing is that there's priorities in everything in every
and I get that
field and a lot of times sadly audio is so funny because a lot of times the priority it's put like last in the priority, but it's the one thing that if you skimp on your audio it like makes everything like sound, you know, it makes everything look bad. So like
Well,
yeah,
in a studio situation, it's like everybody's like, oh, you can just fix it in post, right?
And you know the film world, is like that too. You know, where the visual is the most important thing. And
they
then,
won't even compose the music. They will literally use throwaway music from other movies and then be like, make it sound like that from this other movie. Like, gosh dang.
But yeah, it gets pushed. You know, it gets and like even like it's much better now in video games than it used to be. But it used to be the video games. They're like, well, on this cartridge or this disc, we have this many megabytes or whatever, this many gigabytes, and we'll leave this teeny little bit of space for the audio. And so that's why you have. I mean, that's why those first games were like MIDI, because that's all they had space for was like a little sound card and then the MIDI information to trigger it. Even as it went to past MIDI into like real recorded audio, they were just given this teeny amount of space. You know, nowadays it's much and then there's been steps to make it so that people pay more attention to audio, especially in the film world that happened. And now it is a big important role because people realize it'll ruin your movie, but it's still like tough because like even on film sets they're like, this room looks so cool and it's like mirrors everywhere. Get some good sound here of the dialogue, and it's like
and then they just end up overdubbing over the top anyway.
Yeah, exactly. So
like,
it's got to be replaced, you know. But so that's kind of how it goes. Anyway, so back to live sound and studio. We got off on a tangent there. We apologize for anyone that was hurt by our statements.
I don't apologize for anything I've said on this story.
They were all entirely
they
true.
don't speak for me.
Joe likes to be offensive.
He does.
Yeah, that's how people leave me alone and let me do my work.
The one thing I wanted to get to though,
Yeah.
though I think we've hit all our bullet points, but the other thing is like in a learning environment, and this is something I deal with a lot, where somebody learns how to do recording and audio fundamentals first, and then how do you take those skills to learn, you know, to do studio work or to do live sound work. And it's like, what is the, you know, or somebody that's doing live sound, how do they learn to do the studio stuff? I mean, obviously to me, there's a core set of skills that are going to apply to both, you know, troubleshooting and signal flow, and then the basics of how sound works, how it travels through the air.
Also realizing that you're dealing with amplifiers. And so like in the studio setting, you don't have to really worry about feedback, not in the same sense that I do on a stage. And so it changes your set of priorities when you're using the same tools. That's a simple way of putting, like, I don't do additive EQing in a live situation for the most part. I will occasionally, but realistically, I'm never going to do that. I'm going to be subtracting things. And that's a small deviation between studio where I can be like, yeah, 24 dB of gain on 200 hertz. Don't ever do that. That's
I would never do that.
I would do 15 dB at 8K on a kick though.
Lame.
So
Why not 9K?
So Joe, why
Yeah.
is that? Why is that for subtractive EQ?
Oh,
in live?
because you're dealing
Explain
with
it.
gain structure. No, that's the simple answer is gain structure. So when you're boosting, you're actually affecting the gain structure for that section of frequencies. When you're boosting things, you're increasing that in your amplifier as well. Because remember, the sound is coming from the microphone to the mixer and then sent to an amplifier and then to a speaker driver. And then it's going to be sent out either to a monitor or to the audience. And if you boost too much, you're going to create feedback loops because you're going to be magnifying that. And in a studio, you have fairly good control of acoustics. In a live situation, you really kind of don't. And you're kind of limited by the room. And there are some rooms that just sound horrible, gymnasiums. And like
100 speakers around the sides. That's the solution.
More speaker, less volume, like less speakers, more volume. Those are your kind of your options. But it really affects the gain structure when you're boosting, and where feedback is a bigger problem on a live sound stage than in a studio. That's why you don't generally boost. And especially not by like large margins. Like I don't think I've ever gone over 3 dB, and I don't think I'd ever need to.
Yeah, subtle boostings. And part of it is, and this just goes for good mixing overall, is to realize that, if you cut something, you're essentially boosting around it.
Yeah.
So.
And I'll even make this point, like for live sound, like when people are dealing with monitor mixes, I know we're running out of time, but a lot of times I'll run into this issue. There's two, like you were saying just now, it's the same idea when you're dealing with monitor mixes. You can always increase the volume of the thing you need, but sometimes you should decrease the volume of everything else instead of increasing the volume. Like, oh, I can't hear the lead vocalist, so I'm just going to boost them up. And then you boost that up, and then you're like, oh, I can't hear the guitar, and then you boost that up. And then you find yourself boosting everything on that monitor's channel. And then now you have like red line on your monitors, and the sound engineer's coming over there, unplugging you, lighting things on fire and walking off the stage. I've never done that.
Never, ever.
Never.
I've never lit the stage on fire, that's for sure. Yeah, so like that's why you don't generally boost in live. It's not saying you can't. It's not even saying that you shouldn't. It's just generally not the best way of solving that problem.
So really, it's like cutting EQ because of that gain stage. Dealing with feedback, amplifiers, RF, and then so those are some of the things that studio that studio people would have to learn about live sound. And then going the other way around, there is like the quality of preamps and stuff like that is and microphones really shines through a lot more in recording.
Well, you don't think my SQ6 pre's don't sound good? Like
They
the
do sound
96K
good.
doesn't sound good? You don't think it sounds good?
It sounds good, but it doesn't
that's
sound
right.
as good as like my pre's that are like $500 a channel, $1,000 a channel.
Whatever.
That's
Nobody's gonna hear it in the audience, and that's the rub, kids. Mix good. No, I'm just kidding. And that's how we end it, just like that. None of those yahoos are gonna hear it. None of the meat bags in the audience. Oh, I will say this as well. What? Tell me I'm not wrong when you have to deal with radio, like RF. I'm sorry. Like, how many times have I had issues mixing and, like, losing my wireless microphone because the lead vocalist's like, oh, I want to go engage with the audience. And she's in the other room, too. So, like, I shouldn't say that too loud. No, I'm kidding. I'm not really that mad about it. And usually I work well with that. But it's just one of those things where, like, no, engage with the audience after the concert when I don't have my microphone. I hate you.
I think we need to like have some like graphic of meat bags like banging into Joe's head at this point.
Okay, so let me actually explain something. We're almost out of time, and then I'll end it. The reason why I comment about meat bags and like bodies of water is because that's actually how you lose radio frequency. So when you're sending a wireless microphone frequency from your microphone to your receiver, if you have bodies in the way, that can cancel out whatever range it has. It could say 300 feet, but if you have 500 bodies between you and that receiver, that microphone and that receiver, it won't work. And that's because you have all these bodies basically absorbing the frequencies, like we talk about absorbent panels for like acoustic treatment, same thing, just radio frequency.
Well, they change the sound of a room too. Like
they absorb.
You do your sound
acoustic.
check, and then people come in and pack the room, and all of a sudden, the show sounds way different than sound check.
That's why I'm getting a smart system, but that's another thing.
Okay.
Do you guys have anything left to say? Ready, go.
Nope, I have
shut up.
nothing. I'm good.
Nope. I think just overall, I think there's a core information that applies to everything. Like all those core things, like we talked about EQing, and we talked about signal flow, but like how microphones work, how sound travels through the air, that's all going to apply to both. And yes, there are all these nuances in each that are very different than each other. But I think part of
Ben,
it is respecting the different fields. Like
respect me. For
respecting
what I do.
the fields that we just knocked on people. But no, I think part of it is not coming into it, especially as a studio engineer. I've gone into mixing things and said I was a studio engineer, and they're like, "Oh, you're a studio engineer, and you think you're so." And then I go in and I do a good job, and they're like, "Oh, okay, well, I guess because they're like, well, studio engineers, they'll just spend all day on the kick, and which I have to like tell myself not to do." But like,
It's easy for me. I'm like, this sounds horrible. Moving on.
yeah, it's like, and if somebody they're so ingrained in a world, they don't have respect for the other world that has similarities and such. So it's the same thing when a live sound guy comes into a studio, and they might be like, "Oh yeah, I know what you should do this to the mix and stuff like that." But I think overall, it's respecting the different fields.
Yeah. And I mean, let's be honest, the core tenet of all of this, the thing that really meshes both of these spaces together, mix good. Thanks for joining us with GWNL Podcast. This is Joe. We have Ben and Bryant. Thank you guys so much. 3, 2, 1.
Mix good.
Mix good.